Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for February 19, 2022, the Notorious Markets List. And we begin with that story from Reuters as China objects to U.S. inclusion of Chinese e-commerce firms in the Notorious Markets List, calling it irresponsible. It includes Tencent, Alibaba Group Holdings, and others in the Notorious Markets List. So, who knew? Next up, a very dispiriting story from the Honolulu Civil Beat, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News. And Hawaii's top law enforcement officials say state prosecutors have done nothing with white-collar crime cases and government corruption cases forwarded to them by investigators in the last several years. The chief investigator said that the 3-year-old unit has been slowly crumbling and dissolving from within because of Hawaii prosecutors failing to take up cases that they have submitted. The AG's office has declined to comment on this, but certainly dispiriting news when your chief investigator says the prosecutors won't do anything with the corruption cases we've sent to you. Next up, from the Wall Street Journal, Risk and Compliance Journal, Richard Vandervoort reporting that Canadian banks have been cutting off financial services to people linked with ongoing anti-vaccine mandated demonstrations in Canada, an unprecedented use of financial power following an emergency order from the government. With protesters occupying the streets of Ottawa and several border crossings blockaded, the government used emergency powers to put the nation's, that's Canadians, financial institutions in the unusual position of using their anti-money laundering and sanctions expertise to crank down on banking customers who were a part of these truckers who were protesting the vaccine mandates. The financial institutions have taken action under the economic order that requires them to stop providing financial services to individuals and entities involved in the disruptive protests. So a very interesting use of financial institutions by government in power. And finally, from the New York Times, the Federal Reserve Bank is rolling out, finally, trading restrictions following a huge conflict of interest scandal where Federal Reserve governors were actually using insider knowledge to trade on stocks which were at the core of decisions they were making on the U.S. financial system. Obviously, this is a huge conflict of interest, but I'm certainly glad that the Fed has cracked down on this. The Fed's one of the few remaining political institutions that has credibility in America, and if they hadn't done anything, it probably would have portended a change. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.